My name is Han Hitchen. That's an important thing, my name. I use he, they pronouns, and I am a transgender, non-binary, and gay man, so it's simpler if I just say I'm a queer guy. I like to just say that. Queer is kind of a more encompassing word. There's a lot of different labels that could be accurate for my identity. Demi boy is one that I've recently found, and I'm like, yeah, that's accurate, which is someone who kind of their identity relates to masculinity, but not necessarily in a strong binary sense, which I'm like, yeah, if I'm a guy and non binary, that makes sense. But I try not to be too strict. I mean, in terms of my expression, I love dressing not dressing feminine in a sense, but I love that feminine aesthetics, and when I say feminine also, whenever I say the terms feminine and masculine, I would like to just preface and say that what makes something feminine and masculine is entirely subjective, in my opinion. I think based on how we grow up and are conditioned to associate certain things with masculinity and femininity, I mean, everyone's gonna have different experiences with that. But for me personally, I mean, I love flowers, I love pink, I love soft pastels. My headshot has me wearing a hoodie with like a floral pattern on it. A lot of the headshots have me with like little flowery trees and stuff. That those are my favorite ones. I love that sort of vibe. Some of my favorite outfits to wear are all pinks and purples and soft stuff. One of my favorite shirts has the Powerpuff Girls on it, but like that is something that maybe isn't as relevant to my identity, but in terms of my expression, it's really interesting because, and this is kind of going on a tangent, but realizing I was a man and embracing my identity as a man has been something that has allowed me to finally comfortably explore femininity. Because I remember before I realized specifically that I was a guy, because how it worked for me is I realized that I was non binary first. And then several years later, I realized I was also a trans man. But before I discovered any of that, I remember being so uncomfortable with femininity. I really didn't like makeup. I didn't like wearing skirts. I didn't like shaving certain parts of my body. And I remember, you know, my parents saying to me, why do you struggle to embrace your feminine side? That's something we don't understand. And it wasn't a criticism, but, I think they were genuinely worried about that. And it's really interesting how realizing I'm a man and embracing my masculine side is what finally kind of unlocked my comfort with embracing my feminine side as well, and just being like, yeah, I'm a dude and I love pink and flowers. That's really something that was very important to me. Beyond my gender and sexuality in terms of my identity, I also, do want to preface I am a white guy. I grew up in the US, specifically in South Florida. Being a Floridian is something that is very, very important to me, especially a trans Floridian, given the political nature of the state right now. It's really interesting that I'm in Texas and I'm like, yeah, this is like way better than
Oh,
in
wow.
Florida.
Yeah.
It's really, I mean, Austin in particular is really, really nice. I love Austin. I mean, I would consider staying here, regardless of, Texas's flaws. But Florida, I mean, even my favorite cities in Florida, I can't see as being a safe place for me right now. And that makes me really sad, especially for all the, trans and queer friends I have that are still in Florida.
With all that in mind, this is such a big part of the music you make. I mean, it's clear from like the titles of pieces, you talk about it in your bio. I mean, when did you begin using composition as an expression of your identity?
Funny enough, the very first time I did it was a subconscious one, was a piece I wrote my freshman year of my undergrad. It was for Fix Media. It was called Transchem. And the reason I wrote that piece is because we were doing every year at USF, there was always an electronic music concert that had a particular theme to it. And the theme that year was identity. And I decided I wanted to do a piece about transgender children and their experiences. And, I wanted to kind of put audience members or listeners into the perspective of a trans child. And how I did that is what I did is I took very old documentaries about trans children, interviews with, maybe the parents or other family members, both approving and disapproving of, the trans kid in question's life and their expression of their gender, their exploration of their gender. and just kind of creating a collage of what that is like, what may be going on in their thoughts. And it was funny because I wrote that before I even knew I was non-binary, but in my mind, I knew at that point, I knew that I didn't like identifying as a woman at the time. I knew there was something off about that. I was like, I knew I was queer before anything else. Like, I was like, I
Sure.
know, because at first I was like, okay, maybe I'm just bisexual. Maybe that's it. Maybe I like the same gender as well as men. Because I knew I liked men, but I didn't know. But I wasn't certain that I liked women. But I'm like, well, I'm definitely not a straight woman, so I must be bi. Well, turns out I'm a gay guy. So yeah, that was the whole thing. But that was the first unintentional use of that. The first intentional, I think, was towards the end of my undergrad. I have a flute piece called Omnia Mutantur Nihil Interit. And I wrote it for who's still the flute professor at USF, Francesca Arnone. She's really wonderful flautist. And it was a piece where I wanted to showcase this idea of, well, the title in Latin, it translates to everything changes, but nothing disappears. And I wanted to kind of allude to this idea that as trans people, because there's this sort of narrative. For example, if a person comes out to their parents as trans, the parent, if it's a negative reaction or they're in shock, they might say, "Oh, my son just died or my daughter just died," because they see it as, okay, this is a different person. I've had a lot of people say, "Oh, ever since coming out, this person is a totally different person," when in fact that's not the case. They're I would say it's one of two things. Either they're the same person they've always been, or they're finally showing you the person they've been this whole time, but have been suppressing out of fear of that, um, outlash, I'd say, and that's how I feel it. I mean, that's how I feel it was for me, especially the latter. I feel more so that, yeah, this is who I always was. It's just they were kind of pushed away in the closet. That's why we out of the closet. But yeah, with that piece in particular, I mean, what I did with that, going into like specifics, was I remember I had an interval set. I don't remember what the interval set was, but I remember transforming it throughout the piece, whether by fragmenting it or augmenting it or diminishing it and using microtones to kind of recreate the same amount of space, much squished, and then using extended techniques that have those intervals in them. So maybe sing and play or multiphonics. And by the end, the interval set is still there. It never leaves. It's still there no matter how much it changes, no matter how much it morphs, it's still there.
Is this solo flute or is it flute with electronics?
It's solo flute.
Solo flutes, because the first piece you were describing, that would be incorporating media in some way, or
Yeah,
no?
Transchem, the fixed media piece, was just totally fixed playback. I took audio recordings of interviews and just sort of made like a montage of like, different bits of the interviews that I thought were important. Maybe, one part I really remember is this religious parent saying, "Well, God made you a girl, you can't be a guy." So just taking the phrase "God made you a girl." There was I don't know if it's a slur, but sort of this derogatory term that folks would use, he, she, when they didn't want to use the correct pronoun, but wanted to also use the old one towards a trans person. And the person was saying, "Oh, I get called that at school." And so I had a loop of that going for a portion of the piece, for example. And I remember one layer, there was this really low, like kind of rumbly layer that I just sort of pitch shifted down and stretched out, was a line of someone sort of saying, "Oh, me realizing I was trans is the best thing because I feel like I can finally be myself. I can finally express myself." And that line is revealed at the very end. We have the person saying it, but it's there at the very, very bottom the whole time.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about kind of gets into the other question I had about this, because I
Sorry.
no, 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 it's fantastic, because I think, and there's, just to be clear, there's nothing wrong with this, but it's really easy to just like put a title on some music and write some program notes for some music that, you know, maybe it's a piece that is some sort of activism, but really
Mhm.
it's just like you wrote some program, not you specifically, but like a
Right.
person, composer wrote program notes to accompany this music that otherwise, could maybe be something entirely different or about
Yeah.
something entirely different. So it's really exciting for me to hear like you're incorporating fixed media into these pieces or ideas. You're talking about transformations through extended techniques,
Yeah.
non-standard sounds, microtones. I mean, are there other ways that similarly that you express your identity through music? I mean, can you do that through form or gesture or texture? I mean, you kind of touched on harmony a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a good example of texture is my piece Belonging, which is for bari sax and viola. I wrote the piece for Reduo. They are a really great group. They just had a call for scores. If they do another one in the future, highly, highly recommend. But yeah, I wrote a piece for them. And at that point, that might have been the last piece I wrote before. No, not the last piece, but one of the last pieces I wrote before coming out to my parents, actually. And something that was on my mind a lot was how do I belong in, these different communities, being one where I'm closeted and pretending to be someone I'm not and morphing myself to be someone that fits into that community, as opposed to finding people who just see me who I am and accept me just automatically for me being myself. And let me also just say, not that my parents don't accept me for who I am. Since coming out, they've been very, very supportive. I mean, my dad especially, I cannot like put into words how perfect he has been in terms of like his reaction, his support. It's been really great. But yeah, that piece in particular, I mean, the viola and the bari sax is an interesting combo. You don't see that a lot. And
Yeah.
I really like writing pieces for funky combos like that. So I wanted to explore texture in that piece a lot, but I also wanted to explore, okay, what is it like when you're morphing yourself to fit in with the other person, but then you find moments to pull away and kind of do your own thing and just sort of express yourself in a more individualistic way, but then have moments where you come back and are back together. And whether texturally, gesturally, and that was a really fun piece to do. Funnily enough, that piece also I didn't outright plan and say, "Okay, this is what I'm gonna do to demonstrate, like, them being together. This is when it's gonna happen," and stuff. I just wrote that piece. That was one of the most intuitive pieces I've ever written, and it still kind of did the thing that I do where I think a lot about, you know I mean, in this case, no pun intended, belonging in different communities and, how to put that into music.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Micromaker by Loose Leaf Transmissions. We hope you enjoyed this brief glimpse into the inner workings of the creative life. If this resonated with you, be sure to check out the full conversation on Music Maker with Tyler Kline, a podcast exploring craft and process, philosophy and inspiration, and the honest, often messy parts of being an artist, creative uncertainty, purpose and identity, and resilience. You can find Music Maker wherever you get your podcasts or by visiting musicmakerpodcast.com.